Hello and welcome. It is Vintage Super League time. I'm Randy
Good
Budo,
evening.
joined by Kai Budo. Welcome, Kai.
Hey,
Going to
how are you
be
guys?
an awesome show tonight. 6 matches up from the normal 5, as we've got the makeup match from last week and new decks. Now, what are you expecting, Kai? I know you're not going to tell us what you're actually playing this week, but what do you think everybody else is playing? What were you preparing for?
Well, that's the boring part. First of all, we're starting with the old match, so we don't get to see new decks in the first match. But
Yeah, that's
afterwards,
fair.
my opponents, I think, are Dave, Eric, and Chris Spicula.
Okay.
And I'm kind of expecting at least some amount of stacks in this round. Because
Aha.
there was so much blue, and I mean, there always is so much blue, but there was no stacks in the whole first week, or in the first round of 3 matches. Um, I think there will be stacks. I have very little dredge sideboard, and I have
Okay.
a lot of anti-stack stuff. I'm hoping
Yeah,
that no one is.
Dredge's 0-5 going into this Williams-Pakula match could be 0-6. You think people are just done, that it's just not a good call?
I mean, it didn't do very well, and people had so much sideboard stuff in the last week. I mean, obviously, it might be that there's just not that much sideboard anymore, and Dredge might be a reasonable choice. But I'm pretty sure that Dave is not rerunning Dredge. He was very unhappy with the deck in the first 2 matches. So, and Eric doesn't strike me as a guy playing Dredge. I mean,
Yeah,
Chris could, but I think Chris prefers stacks over Dredge if he wants to have like
okay.
a deck that basically goldfishes. I think he's likely to play stacks.
Now, what do you think about Monastery Mentor? I've seen it in Magic Online daily events. Is somebody going to show up with Monastery Mentor?
I wouldn't bet money against it. There's been a lot of copies in the daily events. It's very powerful. It ends the game much faster than Young Pyromancer. It doesn't lose to Slice and Dice, and it's much easier to protect it against like Pyroclasm kind of effects.
Sure.
Basically, Electricity and Slice and Dice don't do much against that card. Um, Maybe Steven is playing it. Maybe Rich Shea is playing it. Like Rich already had white in his Delver deck last week, so it's only like a logical step to go all the way for Mentor. But I would be surprised if there was none played.
Okay, you would be actively surprised if no one plays Mentor.
Yeah, there were so many in the daily events, and they were doing so well. So I think there's going to be some amount of Mentors.
Interesting. I mean, it is a 3 mana white card. My fear is that it's slow. I mean,
That
I played against it some, and those decks felt like, okay, if they had, a turn 2 Mentor, that was interesting. I mean, it could still be belched before it was relevant, but could be pretty fast. If they didn't have a
just
Mentor, though, the decks felt
the
super slow.
white is a big problem. Like the card would be so much better for Vintage if it just was blue white one to cast. Just being a blue card so you can actually pitch it to Force and Will. Like having cards sit in your hands that you can't pitch to Force and Will is just so annoying.
Sure. Okay, so there's your take on the field. I know that I was asking the people in the chat actually before we got on what they wanted to ask you about, and I want to get your reaction to another Magic Online thing that's been going on. Tempest Remastered has just been announced. Is
Yeah,
this
I
a
mean
set
it
that
was
people
announced a
will
couple of
expect to
days
craft?
ago, right?
A couple
I
days
think I
ago.
saw it. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I've like back Tempest. That was I think it was actually the one of the first PTs I played.
Hmm.
Yeah. Probably. I mean, the thing is, they're cutting out a lot of the cards. I haven't seen the list yet, but that's probably a good thing because back then there were so many bad comments that I mean, the sets for limited were very different back then. Like, I
Oh
think
yeah.
right now a good limited deck is actually defined by your best cards. Like, if you have a great limited deck, you probably have a couple of rares or mystics.
Hmm.
Back then, a good limited deck was defined by actually having 23 good cards because there were a lot of decks that just had to fill with like bad cards. And I mean, these days, if you fill with bad cards, you're playing an off-color morph or like a 3/2 for 3, and you're like, I'm not happy to play this card. But back then, I mean, if you just had unplayable sometimes. Like
Oh yeah.
sometimes you had 20 cards, and then you needed to pull 2 more, but there just wasn't anything. Like sometimes you had to play Disenchant when there were very few targets in the format. And I would guess that they fixed that. I would guess that Tempest Remastered is more like one of the current limited formats with very few unplayables.
Yeah, I know that with Vintage Masters, they clearly managed to take a lot of cards from that era of Magic and stitch them together into a limited environment that I know I enjoyed a lot. I played a lot of VMA drafts and really had a lot of fun with that set.
Yeah, and they didn't like they cleared out the garbage in
Exactly.
there too. Like
Exactly.
there were no very few unplayable. Yeah.
Yeah, I know for me, it's also fun playing playing with cards from back then, it's like, oh, I remember when I was really good at this game. I know how to use these cards. This is great. My wife has actually did some of the playtesting on Tempest Remastered. She had the same thing because she was sort of a PTQ top 8 level player back in the late 90s, and she was just crushing the modern developers right and left because she knew the cards so much better than they did. It's pretty funny.
Iron Duke. I mean, he probably wasn't playing back then. Although he's old enough, I guess. But
Yeah, well, I mean, they started what he was 10 and Reed was 5, I think is about when they started. I mean, they had been what age they were in the late 90s, but not exactly PTQ regulars, I don't think, at 5 and 10.
yeah, no. I think that took a couple of years. Yeah, and I suppose the color hoses are gone, right? Like Tempest was also one of the sets that had like really aggressive color hoses, like Chill and Choke. Chill
Sure.
is the enchantment for 2 mana that makes all red spells cost 2 more. So if you go first and play turn 2 Chill, the red decks usually just can't do anything at all. And Choke, I mean, all islands don't untap. I mean, like those color hoses are just not getting printed again. But back then, like in Tempest, you had like just everything. There were the circles of protection and these cards. Back then, they were actively printing a lot of color hoses.
Now, so you were on the Pro Tour by then, right? Your first PT was, I know it was season 3.
My first PT was actually like the last juniors PT at Pro Tour Rye, and I finished in the top 32 of that and got an invite to Pro Tour Mainz, which was actually Tempest Limited.
Yes,
that was Tempest Limited.
Yeah, it was my second.
Like the thing that the PT in Chicago, the Dirk one, I think that was Tempest Block Limited too, right?
That was full Tempest Block Limited. Yeah,
that was full Tempest Block. Yeah, that was like the first time we did well, and like I think that Chicago, I finished somewhere in the top 20 there, and that got me on the train. And then afterwards, Dirk and me played all the PTs. So yeah, like pretty much Tempest Limited. That's when I started. Like that's when I started playing on the PT.
That works. Another question I got from the chat was actually, how do you get good at Magic? Right? What was the key for you in actually getting to the point where you could succeed on the Pro Tour?
Well, obviously you have to play a lot, and you need to play with better people. Like that's just what helped me a lot. I grew up in Cologne, and in Cologne there was a very strong group of people playing. They were all older than me, and they taught me how to play. Like Frank Adler, one of the early PT winners, was playing.
And for Atlanta, right?
Yeah, this is the all sealed deck PT. But yeah, I mean, you just have to play with good players. Ideally, you have to play with better players, and you have to play a lot. That's how it works.
It's basically.
I mean, back then there wasn't Magic Online. I mean, right now it's like most of the good players right now are probably just playing a lot of Magic Online. Like if you,
it's certainly. I give the same advice to people. I know that the way I got good was when I moved to Pittsburgh. I sort of sought out the players that were better than me, and it was Eric Lauer, it was Andrew Cuneo, it was a guy named Chris Esco, and I just sort of those guys crushed me for a couple of months while I kind of learned what was going on, and then I was the guy who was dragging them to PTQs, and we all kind of got on the Pro Tour together.
That's how it worked back then. Like,
yeah.
These days, it's probably just playing a lot of Magic Online. Like, if you ask
that's where the better players are, right? It's easier to find players that are better than you than it used to be. Sure. You don't have to like luck into a local crowd. You go into Magic Online, right?
But the current generation of like Reed Duke, Owen Turtenwald, Jacob Wilson, Steve McLaren, like I mean, I think they're all coming through Magic Online. I mean, obviously they all played Magic real life, but I think all of them are probably playing several hours per week on Magic Online. Probably more than 15, 20 hours, I would bet. But
that makes sense. All right.
That changed a lot, I think. I mean, back then it was so hard for if you were a PTQ winner, it was so hard to prepare for the PT. I mean, if you were like somewhere in Texas, won a PTQ, like who are you testing with for the PT? I mean, later on there was Apprentice online, but finding people there was super tough. And there's no Magic Online. There were just people coming unprepared to the big tournaments all the time.
So what's
because they didn't have a choice?
The Pro Tour nowadays and sort of how good the players are versus where they were when you were at your peak 10, 15 years ago.
I mean, you can just see how the big teams work. Back then there were no big teams because the good players were trying to beat each other. So there were like groups of like 4 or 5 people playing. But now there's these super teams of groups of 15 people, and they're just making sure that they have an edge over the average player. Back then, you weren't worried about that. Back then, you were worried about beating like Ben Rubin, John Finkel, and these guys. And now you're just worried that your personal edge over the average player is big. which I guess is also related to the PT just being bigger. Like then there was like 250 players, and now it's like 350 to 400.
Yeah.
So you probably play. Although I mean, if you were playing the top 8 region, you were just playing every round against someone you know usually, like at least 2 or 3 rounds. It's highly unlikely that you play against someone that you haven't heard of before.
Yeah, it seems to me that the biggest difference is that the average player on the Pro Tour is just a lot better, and which I think is Magic Online fueled in large part.
Which I mean, there's another thing to it. The average player in general is a lot better. Like the average pro player these days is also a lot better than the average pro player back then.
Okay.
I mean, that's also another thing, because obviously Magic Online is also a tool that helps the professional players a lot. So I think that just in general, everyone got better.
Do you think the top players are significantly better now than they used to be?
Probably. I mean, I think just everyone is better. I mean,
Yeah.
it's tough to say, but I think that the general level of play on the PT is just higher than it used to be.
Yeah, no, I definitely think the average is better. I feel like the middle, if you will, it has moved more than the top has, but
probably. I mean, the thing is, sure, you can play a lot of hours per day Magic Online, but I mean, back when Dirk and me were living in Cologne, we did play like what 5-6 hours per day or something. So I mean, it's not like you could play that much more on Magic Online. But then you needed someone in your area that's on your level to actually play on a good level. And just like getting 8 people for a draft, that wasn't that easy back then. Like if you wanted to have 8 Pro Tour quality people on a draft, I mean, like back then the good players came from the New York area in the States, and that's not. I mean, that's because there's such a high concentration of good players, so they're just helping each other getting better.
Oh yeah, I remember hosting all of them down in Pittsburgh one weekend. Sort of had this massive like 3-pod draft practice.
Back then it was always local concentrations of players. Like there was a group in Pittsburgh, there was a group in New York, and now it's like Owen living somewhere in the middle of the States, and then Reed somewhere in and Julius in Vegas. But like it doesn't matter. They can still play all day together if they wanted to.